The kitchen light in my rented room was too dim to feel real. The bulb buzzed and it made everything look tired. I stood on cold linoleum with my phone in one hand, watching my bank app load like it might show me a better number. It didn't. A red banner at the top told me I was overdue. On the table, a stack of unopened envelopes sat in a neat pile. I didn't open them because I already knew what they said, but I kept the corners aligned anyway, like order could keep the problem from spreading. My keys hung on the same hook by the door, wallet left, badge right, shirt over the chair. If I couldn't control the money, I could control the small things. My phone vibrated, and my stomach tightened before I even looked. The clinic number. I set the phone on the table and hit play. The nurse voicemail said evenly, "Mr. Pike, your mom's payment is overdue. Please call us back tonight." When the message ended, the room felt like it was listening. The debt wasn't abstract. It had my mom's name on it, her birthday under a barcode, and my signature on the intake forms from last month when I'd promised we'd figure it out. I stared at the dark screen and tried to breathe past the tightness in my throat. In the next room, she was asleep on the pull-out couch, breathing shallow, a blanket tucked up to her chin. I opened my notes app and scrolled to the list I kept for nights like this: leave on time, take the same route, park in the same spot, badge in, lock behind you, exact times, exact turns, exact objects in exact places, because staying inside the fence was easier than admitting how thin the ground was. If I changed one step, my mind would start racing, and then I'd make a real mistake. Before this job, I worked industrial electrical. The accident that rewired me didn't look dramatic from the outside. It started with a tiny metal tapping that should have stopped, a relay that wouldn't settle, a rhythm repeating like it wanted my attention. Then the smell hit. Scorched metal and melting insulation, sweet and toxic at the same time. I remember a panel door shivering and the sound turning into a steady pulse I couldn't escape. After that, anything out of sync got under my skin. A ceiling fan clicking off-beat could make my hands sweat. A turn signal blinking too fast could spike my pulse. I couldn't tolerate it, not in machines, not in people, not in myself. So I built my life out of checklists, because checklists don't drift. They don't improvise, they don't lie. I checked the time again. The night shift paid more, and that extra pay was the only thing keeping my mom's treatment from stalling. The differential wasn't a bonus, it was her refills. I stared at the envelopes, then at my badge, then at my hands. I muttered, "I can't quit. Not yet." The words came out rough, like they'd been waiting all day. I grabbed my keys, felt the cold metal bite my palm, and forced myself to move in the right order. Phone, wallet, badge, one more check. Then the door. I tried to stay calm. Just follow the checklist. Just get through the night. Highway 17 at night felt less like a road and more like a thin agreement with the dark. The farther I drove from Savannah, the more the air changed. Salt first, then river damp, then a faint industrial bite when the wind shifted and carried diesel from the port. Sodium yellow streetlights washed the lanes in tired color, and every few miles I caught a slice of black water through the trees, reflecting light in broken strips. I kept my speed steady and my hands in the same places on the wheel. The address on my phone was more pin than place, like whoever built it didn't want it found by accident. When I hit the turnoff, the tires crunched over gravel and the sound seemed too loud. The service lane narrowed, trees leaned in, and the river smell got stronger. The city glow faded behind me until I could mostly hear my engine and the tires. A chain-link fence ran along the left for a while, broken by a sign with generic warnings that really meant you were on your own. Then the structure appeared ahead, squat and plain, a small concrete control hut set back from the water with a short metal stair and a door that looked like it belonged on a utility closet. Beside it stood rail signal hardware on posts, thick cables feeding into conduit. Beyond that, the bridge mechanism sat low and dark, heavy with hydraulics, steel, and grease. The annex felt isolated in a way distance alone couldn't explain. Highway 17 was close enough that I could still see its faint glow through the trees, but the control hut sat just outside it, like the light didn't quite reach. I parked where the gravel was worn down, killed the engine, and let the silence rush in. The river moved somewhere beyond the brush, slow and patient. A woman stepped out from shadow near the door. She moved like she belonged here, like metal and darkness were part of her routine. She wasn't friendly, and she wasn't trying to scare me either. She just looked tired in the exact way people do when they've stopped being surprised by anything. Nora said quietly, "You're Jonah, right? Badge in, then lock it behind you." I pulled out my badge, the plastic edge cold against my thumb. The reader beeped once, clean and final, and the lock clicked. Nora watched the door the whole time, not me, like she was listening for something that didn't have a voice. When I stepped inside, the air turned warmer and drier, carrying faint dust and old coffee. The control room was smaller than I expected. A main console faced a wide window toward the bridge, with indicators, switches, and screens for the cameras. 2 yellow lines were painted on the floor in front of the console, parallel and too deliberate to ignore. A phone console hung on the wall to the right, its line labels neatly printed. Under it sat a heavy metal bin with a kick lid. To the left, a narrow corridor ran to an equipment room door, and farther down, a thicker door with a round porthole window. Nora handed me a ring of keys and a laminated radio card. She didn't waste words. She showed me what to touch, what not to touch, and how to speak on the radio so nobody missed meaning. I followed her down the corridor. The equipment room door on the right didn't sit fully shut. It was cracked open, just a thin slice of darkness between the frame and the door, as if someone had measured the gap and decided it mattered. At the end of the corridor, the West River door faced me with that round porthole glass set into it, thick enough to warp reflections at the edges. Behind it, I could hear the river, not waves, just slow-moving water and wind dragging through reeds. Nora stopped beside a tall cabinet bolted to the wall. Its handles were wrapped with lead wire twisted tight, not like a padlock, but like a seal. A warning label was taped to the front in plain block letters. Nora snapped, "Don't touch the archive cabinet, ever." I nodded. I didn't ask why. Still, my eyes stayed on the lead wire a beat too long. It was too deliberate to be a joke. It looked like something you sealed to keep a mistake from spreading. Back in the control room, Nora walked me through the console in clean gestures. She pointed out the rail signal indicator, the hydraulic pressure readouts, the manual override behind a protective cover, and the camera feeds, including the one labeled Camera 3. She tapped the yellow lines with the edge of her shoe, then looked at me like she was checking whether I'd remember they existed. Then she gestured toward the phone console. One of the line labels had been blacked out with tape, not removed, not replaced, just covered, as if the number itself was the problem. The rest of the labels were intact and tidy. I'd seen plenty of old fixes in my life, and this wasn't one. On the far side of the console, a thermal printer sat on a small stand, scuffed and yellowed at the edges, with a fresh roll of paper loaded. I didn't touch it, but when I leaned close, I felt faint warmth coming off the casing, like it had been running recently. The room wasn't hot. The warmth didn't fit. Nora insisted, "The printer will give you your checklist. Follow it exactly." She said it like policy, not superstition, like doing it wrong had consequences she didn't want to describe. She clipped the radio on my belt, showed me where the spare battery lived, and then drifted toward the door as if she didn't want to stay a minute longer than she had to. She didn't tell me good luck. She just left me with the console, the yellow lines, the corridor, and the sealed cabinet that felt like it was holding its breath. The radio crackled, and a voice came through clear and solid. No distortion, no whispering, just a man doing his job. The normal sound of it hit me with relief I didn't expect. Vic barked over the radio, "Control Annex, you got me." I held the handset closer and forced my voice to stay even. I didn't want him to hear doubt. Doubt had a way of spreading. I tried to stay calm over the radio. "Yeah, I've got you. This is Jonah," Vic said evenly over the radio. "This is Vic. Welcome to Nights." The way he said it made Nights sound like a department, like a place people worked, not a place where things happened. I held on to that idea and looked around the room one more time, naming what was real. The console, the screens, the rail signal lights, the 2 yellow lines. Camera 3 watching from somewhere I couldn't see. Then my eyes drifted to what didn't feel real at all, the tape over the phone line label and the lead wire twisted tight on the archive cabinet. I told myself the rest would be simple, a job you could solve with procedures and time, and I kept my hands off everything I hadn't been told to touch. The printer didn't make a show of it. It woke up, whirred once, and pulled the paper forward like it had been waiting. The roll clicked, a strip of warm white slid out, and the top line printed in blocky letters. Night Operations, Checklist. Under that, 11 rules stacked in a tight column, short, specific, and written like someone expected obedience. I held the paper by its edges and read. The first lines almost sounded normal, the kind of rules you find anywhere that runs heavy equipment after midnight. Never answer line 9. Don't open the West River door from 111 to 133. If the rail signal flashes 3 times with no train, leave the control room and wait under the awning until it stops. Blunt tone, no explanation, just action. Then the list kept going and the normal feeling thinned out. If you hear knocking inside the cable conduit, don't knock back, don't speak into it. If your reflection desinks in the west door porthole, don't blink, step back 3 steps, and say the phrase to Vic. After 2 o'clock, don't stand between the 2 yellow floor lines in front of the main console. Keep the equipment room door cracked exactly 2 fingers wide. If the printer spits a slip without Eli's signature, tear it and drop it in the metal bin. The last rules were smaller on paper, but they hit me in the gut anyway. If the radio turns into a long whistle, don't lower the volume, just log the timestamp. If you smell metal on your skin, wash your hands for 20 seconds, no citrus soap. If camera 3 shows the bridge open while you can see it closed, trust your eyes and do the awning rule. Each one sounded like it had been written after someone tried the obvious thing and paid for it. I stared at the page until the words started to feel less like ink and more like fences. These weren't written to keep the bridge safe. They were written to keep the person in this room from doing the one thing that always gets people killed in bad places, reacting. I looked up at Nora, expecting a grin, some hint that this was crew humor. She didn't smile. She watched me read like she'd already seen every reaction, and none of them changed the night. Her eyes flicked toward the corridor, toward that West River door, then back to me. I muttered. "Is this a prank?" Nora said quietly. "No." She didn't add anything. The word landed heavy, not dramatic, just final. I read the list again, slower, tracking each line with my thumb. The rules weren't poetic. They were practical, in a way that made my skin prickle, because practical rules come from experience. My attention drifted to the phone console on the wall. One label was blacked out with tape, neat and intentional. It didn't look like a repair. It looked like someone had decided a number itself was dangerous. I kept my distance from it and held the checklist tighter. Nora tried to stay calm. "You'll understand if you make it to morning." The way she said it tightened my stomach. She wasn't promising anything. She was drawing a line. I wanted to ask questions, but my throat closed around them, and I nodded once like nodding could keep me out of trouble. The radio on my belt crackled, and Vic's voice came through clean and steady, like this was just another shift. Vic said flatly over the radio, "Read it once, then read it again." I did. The second pass didn't make it easier. It made it clearer. The rules were built around containment. Don't feed it. Don't give it your voice. Don't give it your attention at the wrong angle. Don't stand where it wants you. Don't open the door when it's waiting on the other side of the mine at hand. Keep your logs honest. At the bottom of the sheet there was a blank line for a signature. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. A signature meant responsibility. A signature meant I couldn't pretend I hadn't been warned. My hand hovered. Then I took the pen from my pocket and wrote my name in one clean motion. The ink looked too dark against the thermal paper, like it didn't belong there. I folded the checklist in half, then in half again, and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket like it was policy. Then I went to the schematic binder and flipped to the phone line map. I traced the printed labels until I reached the gap where 9 should have been. It wasn't there. The numbering skipped cleanly, as if the place had never learned how to count that far. I closed the binder and stood still, listening. Outside, the river moved, slow and steady. Inside, the printer sat quiet with its paper roll loaded, warm like it had a pulse, waiting for the moment it needed to speak again. At midnight, I started the baseline log like Nora had shown me, slow and precise, no skipping, no guessing. 10 minutes past midnight wasn't a dramatic milestone, but I treated it like one anyway. Those first 10 minutes were the clean line at the top of the page, the proof of what normal looked like before the night had a chance to drift. Rail signal steady, no train in the block, hydraulic pressure in the green, wind low, camera feed stable, manual override cover latched and sealed. I wrote it all down in the same plain shorthand, because plain shorthand didn't invite interpretation. Once the baseline was done, I moved into a full sweep the way I'd learned in industrial work, starting with what could hurt someone fastest if it failed. Hydraulics first. I watched the pressure hold steady and listened for uneven whine from the pump, the kind of vibration you feel in your teeth before a sensor ever catches it. Nothing. Then the rail signal status, then the real lights outside through the window, because I didn't trust screens unless reality agreed with them. Match. That mattered. It meant the annex wasn't lying to me yet. I pulled up camera 3 and watched it long enough to feel bored. The feed showed the approach road, the barrier arms, and a slice of steel framing near the bridge. Nothing moved except leaves shifting when the wind pushed through. The other cameras showed the corridor, the equipment room door, and the West River door at the end. I noted the feeds were clean and moved on without lingering, because lingering was how you turned a tool into a fear. I set up my station the way I always did when I needed my mind to stay inside its lane. Mug on the coaster, handle turned toward me, clipboard squared on the right edge of the desk, pen clipped at the top so it couldn't roll, gloves on the left, palms up, fingers pointing toward me, chair angled a few degrees off square so my knee wouldn't catch the cabinet when I stood. It was all small and ordinary, and that was the point. If those anchors stayed put, I could trust that I was the one moving through the room, not the room moving around me. The first hour was boring in the best way. I ran the warning test sequence, watched the indicators light in order, and logged the results with no flourish. I did wine checks when the console prompted me, took averages, wrote them down, then returned to the same loop. Hydraulics, rail signal, camera 3, warning systems, manual override latch, log the time in plain words, log the result in plain terms, repeat. The routine turned the annex into a workplace instead of a story. The printer chirped once and fed out a short maintenance slip with Eli's name at the bottom in blocky letters, the kind of stamped signature you see on forms that have been copied too many times. The task was ordinary. Tighten a hinge on an exterior cabinet latch. I tore the slip along the perforation, tightened the screw a quarter turn, and logged it as complete. That one small, normal problem eased something in my chest. Hinges loosen, weatherwork screws. That was the world I understood. At 12:55 a.m., the radio crackled and Vic's voice cut through clean and solid. No distortion, no whisper, just a man doing his job. Vic barked over the radio. Confirm traffic hold. I glanced at camera 3. No headlights. The barrier status showed down and locked. The rail signal indicator stayed steady. I forced my voice to stay even because calm was part of the job, and panic didn't help anyone on the other end of a wire. I said evenly over the radio. Traffic hold confirmed. I logged the call and the confirmation, then watched the approach again for a few more seconds, just in case the camera feed was late or my eyes were. Vic asked for routine wind checks and a minor display reset after that, the kind that cleared stale status without touching hardware. Each time, I followed the same sequence before I answered. Check camera 3, check rail signal, check barrier status, then act, then log. If I kept the steps consistent, drift would show itself. The hours after that stayed quiet enough that I could feel my shoulders unclench. The annex hummed like any other piece of infrastructure. The console fans buzzed. The lights held steady. The river moved behind the west door, slow and patient. I didn't open that door. I didn't need to. I treated it like a boundary line, the way you treat an unguarded edge in a factory, not because you're afraid of the edge, but because it doesn't care if you fall. Every so often, the printer fed out another Eli slip, and each one was reasonable. Check a drain grate, inspect a junction for seepage, confirm the paper roll feed is smooth. I reset my anchors the same way. It wasn't superstition, it was measurement. If something moved without me, I wanted to know. By the time the clock crept past 2 a.m., I made a point of noting it in my log because the checklist had drawn a hard line there. After 2, don't stand between the 2 yellow floor lines in front of the console. I didn't test it. I didn't step between them to see what would happen. I stayed outside those lines without thinking about it, like they were wet paint. If the rules were wrong, it cost me nothing. If they were right, it might cost me everything. Near the end of the stretch, Vic checked in again, and his voice carried that thin edge of someone managing a long night without letting it show. Vic tried to stay calm over the radio. You're doing fine. Keep logging, Jonah said quietly. Copy. I wrote the check-in down, then sat back and listened. The room sounded ordinary, and I wanted to keep it that way. Then the radio did something that made my spine stiffen. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't normal static. For a fraction of a second, it thinned into a single rising note, like the beginning of a long whistle, as if someone had started to blow across the mouth of a bottle and then stopped. My hand twitched toward the volume knob on instinct, but I froze it in place. The note died before it fully arrived, and the radio returned to clean silence. I didn't touch the volume. I didn't swap the battery. I didn't speak into it. I looked at the clock, then at my log, and I wrote what happened in plain words. Brief whistle tone, less than a second, then normal. I underlined it once, not for drama, but because I needed it to exist on paper. I needed proof that normal had almost changed and that I'd noticed it in time. The printer chirped like it had decided to clear its throat. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been looking at it. One moment the room was just fans and fluorescent hum. The next the paper feed clicked and a strip slid out as if a hand inside the casing had pushed it forward. I let it print fully before I tore it off, because the checklist had already taught me not to get impatient with things that moved on their own in this building. The slip was short, one line of instruction, then a second line that didn't read like maintenance at all. It read like a prediction written by someone who had watched me from inside my own habits. It said that within 10 minutes my mug would tip, not because I bumped it, but because the coaster would stick to the bottom for half a second and then peel free late. It said the coffee would land in a thin crescent on the right side of the clipboard, and that my pen would roll left, not right, and tap the table leg twice before it stopped. The language was blunt and practical, like it had been written by someone who knew exactly what right side of the clipboard meant to me. It even mentioned the handle position, like that mattered to the outcome. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. Then I checked my anchors. Everything was locked. I tried to laugh, but the sound didn't come out right. This wasn't some vague warning about danger. This was petty, domestic, absurdly specific. I muttered, "That's not funny." It felt childish saying it out loud in an empty control room, but it was the only honest reaction I had. I set the slip down and decided to ignore it. I wasn't going to let a strip of paper tell me what would happen to my coffee. I wasn't going to start treating random prints like prophecy. I went back to routine. Hydraulic steady, rail signal steady. Camera 3 showed nothing but a quiet approach and leaves moving in the wind. I ran my eyes across the console readouts and forced my breathing to slow. The night was still boring. The bridge stayed closed. The river stayed behind its door. The printer went quiet again, like it had said its piece and didn't care if I believed it. I picked up my mug for a sip, the same way I always did. The coffee was lukewarm now, bitter and thin, and I didn't care. I set the mug back down on the coaster with the same careful motion. That was when I felt it. A tiny resistance, like the coaster had glued itself to the base. Not much. Just enough that my hand instinctively tightened. I tried to lift away, and the coaster came up with the mug stuck flat to the bottom like a suction cup. My mind snapped to the slip. My stomach dropped. I tried to correct, to set it down clean, but my wrist hesitated. That half second was all it took. The coaster peeled free late, just like the slip had said, and the mug tilted at an angle I hadn't chosen. Coffee sloshed over the rim in a thin, dark arc. It didn't splash everywhere. It landed in a neat crescent on the right side of the clipboard, soaking the paper exactly where my notes were most dense. The smell hit first, sharp and hot even though the drink wasn't. Then the pen, dislodged by the slight bump I hadn't felt myself make, slid loose. It didn't roll right. It rolled left. It clicked off the edge of the clipboard, hit the tabletop, and bumped the table leg twice in quick, identical taps before it settled. Tap, tap. I froze, hand still half open above the mess, my brain trying to find a way to explain it without admitting what it meant. I stared at the crescent stain like it was a mark on a map. I stared at the pen lying perfectly still on the left side as if it had been placed there. I stared at the slip on the desk, the stupid little strip of paper that had just described the moment I was living inside. I didn't feel scared at first. I felt exposed, like the annex had leaned close and spoken softly into my routine, proving it could see the smallest moves I made before I made them. My radio crackled at my hip, and the sound yanked me back into my body. My fingers shook as I reached for it. I didn't want to make another mistake. I didn't want to move anything else out of place. Vic barked over the radio, Jonah, what happened? I swallowed, tasted coffee and adrenaline, and tried to keep my voice from cracking. I didn't want to sound hysterical. I didn't want to hand that to the night, I said quietly over the radio. Something printed. Then it came true. There was a short pause, the kind that feels longer when you're the one waiting. Then Vic came back, his tone firmer, like he was clamping down on something he didn't want to name. Vic insisted over the radio, "Stick to the rules. Don't improvise." I cleaned the spill with paper towels, slow and methodical, as if moving carefully could rewind time. I swapped the top page on the clipboard and logged the incident without decorating it. Mug tipped, spill on right side of clipboard, pen rolled left, 2 taps against table leg. I wrote it down because writing it down was the only way to keep it from turning into something unreal later. When I finished, I reset my anchors. It felt desperate, but it also felt like the only language I had. Then the rail signal flashed. Not a steady pattern, not a normal cycle. 3 sharp flashes in quick succession, like a code. I looked out the window to the actual hardware and saw the same thing, bright bursts that lit the nearby metal and then snapped back to dark. I checked camera 3, expecting headlights, motion, any sign of a train approaching. Nothing. The approach road was empty. The frame was calm. The signal kept its 3-beat warning anyway. My mind went straight to the checklist, not because I wanted it to, but because there was no other place to go. 3 flashes with no train. Leave the control room. Wait under the awning until it stops. I stood up and felt my heartbeat thud against my ribs. I didn't run. I didn't rush to the phone. I didn't touch the volume knob on the radio. I moved like I was walking through a factory floor with live lines overhead, careful and strict, because strict was how you stayed alive around things that didn't forgive. I left the control room and stepped into the corridor. The equipment room door was still cracked the same thin amount, the dark slice unchanged. I didn't touch it. I kept moving. At the end of the corridor, the West River door sat heavy and shut, its round porthole glass reflecting a warped version of the hallway light. I didn't look into the glass longer than a glance. I didn't want to see anything I couldn't unsee. I went through the main exit and onto the little covered stretch outside, the awning that hugged the building like a shallow shelter. The air hit me cold and wet, full of river smell and distant diesel. The wind moved through the reeds with a low whisper. The world out here felt bigger, but also more exposed, like the darkness had room to breathe. I stood under the awning and watched the rail signal hardware from the side. The light flashed again, once, then twice, then stopped. The sudden return to normal was almost worse than the flashing, because it felt like a decision. Like something had tried a door and then chosen to wait instead. I didn't go back in right away. I held myself still, listening. The annex behind me hummed softly. The bridge structure loomed out of sight but present in the air, a mass of metal that could move when commanded. The river kept sliding past, patient and dark. That's when I heard the knocking. It didn't come from the door. It didn't come from the window. It came from the conduit, from somewhere inside the walls or beneath the concrete, as if a hand had found the cable channel and was tapping from within. The sound was faint, careful, almost polite. Tap, tap. It paused, like it was waiting for an answer. Every nerve in my body wanted to respond. That's the cruelest part of a knock. It makes you feel obligated. It makes you feel rude for ignoring it. My hand twitched, fingers curling like I might tap back on the railing or speak into the dark and ask who was there. A stupid reflex, a human reflex. The checklist cut through that reflex like a blade. Don't knock back, don't speak into it. I clenched my hands at my sides until my nails bit my skin. I kept my mouth shut. I didn't even clear my throat. I stared straight ahead, Not at the conduit, not at the door, not at the river, and I counted my breaths the way I'd counted seconds in a loud room after the accident. The knocking came again, a little firmer this time, still controlled, still tempting. Tap, 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 then it stopped. I waited under the awning until the silence settled again, and then I went back inside with the same measured steps. I didn't slam the door. I didn't hurry. I locked it behind me because that's what you do, because a locked door is at least a statement. In the control room, the air felt warmer than before, like the building had been holding heat for me. I went straight to the log and wrote the event down in words, not numbers, careful and plain. Rail signal flashed 3 times with no train observed. Waited under awning until flashing stopped. Heard faint knocking from conduit while under awning. Did not respond. Logged the time in plain words the way I'd been doing all night, because I didn't want the log to start sounding like a panic diary. Only after I wrote it down did I look at camera 3 again. For a second, the feed showed something that didn't match. The barrier arms looked raised, as if the bridge approach were open, and the edge of the steel framing seemed shifted, like the bridge deck wasn't sitting where it should. It wasn't blurry, it wasn't static. It was clean, crisp, and wrong. I blinked once, hard, and the frame snapped back to normal. Barrier arms down, deck aligned, road empty, leaves moving, nothing to see. My throat tightened. I leaned closer to the screen as if proximity could force the truth out of it, but the feed stayed calm, like it had never shown me anything else. I sat back slowly, hands flat on the desk, and listened to the annex hum. The printer sat quiet. The slip with the prediction lay on the table, coffee stained at the corner where I'd set it. The rail signal indicator held steady. The radio stayed silent. Everything looked normal again. But the normal had cracked, and I could feel the cold air of that crack every time I breathed. The first thing that went wrong wasn't a scream or a shadow. It was the console hesitating under my hands, like a muscle refusing to move the way it always had. I pressed the same button I'd pressed all night, the same sequence, the same timing, and the input lagged just long enough for my stomach to tighten. The confirmation tone came late. The screen refreshed late. The little progress bar that never mattered suddenly mattered, because it was the only thing between a calm system and one that started making choices without me. I checked hydraulics again. The pressure was still in the green, but it wasn't sitting as comfortably as it had earlier. The needle trembled, not enough to set off a warning, but enough to look indecisive. I watched it for a full minute, waiting for it to settle. It didn't. The wind indicator bumped up, then down, then up again, as if the air outside was tugging at the bridge in short, impatient pulls. On camera 3, the approach road stayed empty, but the exposure shifted slightly, then corrected, then shifted again. It wasn't dramatic. It was inconsistent, and inconsistency was how the night got you. I ran a full warning sweep. Most indicators stayed steady, but one of the status windows stuttered as it updated, like the interface was catching on a snag. I cleared it and logged the reset, and I told myself it was just software. Old systems freeze, old sensors chatter. That's normal. The annex was old, the bridge was older. None of this had to mean anything. Then the phone console lit up. The taped-over label was still taped over, but the indicator above it was alive, flashing in a steady, impatient pulse. I stared at it, waiting for my brain to correct what my eyes were seeing. It didn't. The light kept blinking, bright and clean, like a call coming in from somewhere that had every right to exist. The rest of the room didn't change. The fans kept buzzing. The fluorescent light held its sickly, steady tone. The river stayed behind the west door. Only that one line demanded attention. The call stopped for half a second, then started again. It wasn't a random ring. It was timed. It felt like it had learned my breathing. I felt the old reflex rise in me, the stupid human reflex to answer a ringing phone because unanswered rings feel like failure. I forced my eyes away and checked camera 3 again. Still empty. Rail signal steady, barrier arms down. Everything looked safe. The phone kept insisting otherwise. The radio crackled, and Vic's voice cut through before I could reach for the handset. He didn't sound curious. He sounded sharp, like he'd heard the ring through the system and hated it. Vic barked over the radio. "If the console starts acting up, do not answer line 9. My throat tightened. So it was line 9. Not a glitch. Not a mislabeled indicator. The thing that wasn't on the schematic, the thing the numbering skipped cleanly, was calling like it had always been there. The light blinked again, steady as a heartbeat I didn't want. I kept my hands on the desk to stop them from drifting toward the phone. I stared at the taped-over label and tried to turn it into an object, not an invitation. The phone rang again, then cut out, then rang again, faster this time. The console input lagged once more under my fingers as I pulled up a status window, and the hydraulic needle twitched in a way that suggested the system was under more strain than the quiet outside implied. I didn't know if the strain was real or manufactured, and that uncertainty was the problem. If I ignored the call and something went wrong out there, it wouldn't be the annex paying for it. It would be whoever was unlucky enough to be on the wrong side of a barrier arm. The light blinked again. The ring sound wasn't loud, but it filled the room anyway, because it didn't belong. It rang like it was inside my skull instead of on the wall. I swallowed, tasted stale coffee, and forced myself to look at the bridge through the window as if the bridge might give me permission. All I saw was steel and darkness and a soft smear of river reflection. The radio stayed quiet. Vic didn't fill the silence. He'd said what he needed to say. The responsibility was mine now. The call cut off, then started again, and something in me snapped, not with anger, but with panic disguised as duty. If this was an emergency line, if this was a misrouted call, if this was a person somewhere in the system trying to prevent a real accident, then ignoring it would be the kind of mistake you can't write your way out of. I could already see the report in my head. Operator failed to respond. Delay in action, preventable outcome. A clean list of words that would land on my mom's treatment like a brick. I muttered, "It keeps ringing." The ring continued as if it had heard me. The light blinked in a steady pattern that felt proud of itself. My palm hovered near the handset, then pulled back, then hovered again. I looked at the checklist in my pocket without taking it out, like I could feel the words through the fabric. Never answer line 9. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the first fence. I took a breath and tried to force logic into my bloodstream. A bridge control annex doesn't need a line that isn't on the schematic. If the system needed me, Vic would tell me. If traffic needed holding, the cameras would show headlights. If a train was approaching, the rail signal would change. The only thing demanding my attention was a rule that said it would, and a phone that rang like it took offense to being ignored. The console lagged again, worse this time. I pressed a button and the screen stayed still for a full second before it responded. The hydraulic needle dipped, then recovered. A pressure warning flashed briefly, then vanished before I could read the full line of text. My mouth went dry. A real operational risk was unfolding, and it was doing it in fragments, just enough to keep me guessing. If I did nothing, I could be letting the system slide into failure. If I did the wrong thing, I could be opening a door I couldn't close. I tried to stay calm. I can't let someone get hurt. Then I reached for the handset. The moment my fingers touched it, the ring stopped. Not because I'd answered, because it had decided it had me. The room felt closer, the air thicker, like the annex had leaned in. I lifted the handset and brought it to my ear, expecting static, a wrong number, a confused voice asking for directions. I expected anything that lived in the world I knew. The voice on the line didn't sound far away. It sounded like it was already in the room, using the phone as a courtesy. The Line 9 voice said flatly, "Jonah Pike, West Door, now." My skin went cold. Nobody here should have known my full name except Nora and Vic, and neither of them would use it like that. The voice didn't ask. It didn't explain. It issued a command like a supervisor who'd already given up on your excuses. I snapped, "Who is this?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt measured, like the voice was letting my question hang there as proof that I still thought questions mattered. The Line 9 voice insisted, "You're late." The word late landed in my chest like a weight. Late for what? Late to do what? Late according to whose clock? The annex clock over the console ticked forward, steady and innocent. Outside, the bridge stayed still. Inside, the phone line had just implied there was a schedule I'd already failed to meet. I set the handset down too hard, then forced myself to correct the movement and place it properly, like politeness would protect me. My heart hammered. I grabbed the radio and stared at it, wanting Vic to cut in and tell me this was a drill, wanting him to say the obvious thing, wanting him to take the responsibility back. The radio stayed quiet. The printer chirped. The paper feed clicked and a slip slid out halfway, then stopped, like it wanted me to take it. I stared at the bottom of the slip first, because Eli's name had been my little anchor all night. Eli's signature meant normal. Eli's signature meant a human hand somewhere in the chain. There was no signature. The bottom line was blank. The text above it was short and clean, just like the earlier slips, but it didn't tell me to tighten a hinge or clear a drain. It told me to check the west door. It told me to use the porthole glass. It told me to do it now. Rule 8 flashed through my head, sharp as a warning label. If the printer spits a slip without Eli's signature, tear it and drop it in the metal bin. Don't read it out loud. I should have torn it immediately. I should have treated it like contaminated paper. Instead, I stared at it until the words felt like they were staring back. The room kept humming like nothing had changed. The console lights blinked their normal patterns. The phone sat quiet now, satisfied. The taped-over label looked like a bruise on the wall. My hands hovered between the slip and the metal bin, and I could feel how easy it would be to do the right thing. Rip the paper, drop it, log it, move on, but I was already in motion. That was the trap. The call had pushed my brain into crisis momentum, and crisis momentum makes you do the next step even when you know you shouldn't. I folded the slip once without meaning to. I held it like a directive, like policy. I walked into the corridor with careful steps, keeping my shoulders square, keeping my breathing slow. The equipment room door was still cracked the same thin amount, that slice of darkness unchanged. I didn't touch it. I didn't even look into it. I kept moving toward the West River door at the end, the one with the thick porthole glass that warped reflections at the edges. The air got cooler as I approached it, or maybe I just noticed the absence of the control room's warmth. I stopped in front of the door and stared at the porthole. The glass reflected the corridor light in my own face, stretched slightly at the edges, pale and tense. For a second, it looked normal enough to make me feel foolish. Then, my reflection moved wrong. It wasn't a jump scare. It wasn't a new face. It was me, but delayed by a fraction of a second, like a video feed with lag. I blinked, and the reflection blinked late, I swallowed, and the reflection's throat moved after mine. My skin prickled all over, and my hands went numb because my body understood something my mind refused to accept. The annex was doing to me what the console had done to my inputs. It was adding delay. It was making me desync. Rule 5 snapped into place. If your reflection desyncs in the west door porthole, don't blink, step back 3 steps, and say the phrase to Vic. I froze, eyes burning from the urge to blink. I forced them open wider. I stepped back once, then twice, then 3 times, heels landing softly on the corridor floor. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might shake my vision further out of sync. I brought the radio to my mouth with a hand that didn't feel like it belonged to me, and I forced myself to say the required phrase to Vic, exactly as written, without adding a single extra word. I used the exact phrase the checklist demanded. The radio crackled in response, but no voice came through. Not Vic. Not anyone. Only that thin layer of static, like the system was holding its breath. I stood there with my eyes wide and dry, staring at the porthole glass from 3 steps back. My reflection stared back, but it didn't match my timing. It copied me like it was learning. The slip without a signature crinkled in my fist, and I realized I was still holding it, still treating it like a normal directive, even though the rules had told me what to do with it. In the control room behind me, the phone console lit up again. I didn't turn around to confirm it. I didn't need to. I could feel the insistence in the air, the way a ringing line pulls at the room even when you aren't looking at it. The annex had started to behave like the rules were suggestions, not fences, like it could rewrite the order of operations, swap steps, make the next right move, arrive too late. I backed away from the west door, still fighting the blink, and the corridor seemed longer than it had been a minute earlier. Not by much, just enough to make my stomach twist. The control room lights looked a little farther away. The hum sounded slightly muffled, like it was coming through a wall that hadn't been there before. I wanted to run. I wanted to rip the slip into pieces and cram it into the metal bin and pretend I hadn't answered anything. I wanted the night back the way it had been when the worst thing in the world was coffee on paper. But I'd already picked up the handset. I'd already heard my name spoken by a line that wasn't supposed to exist. I'd already watched my reflection fail to keep up with me. The point of no return wasn't a door opening. It was the moment I realized the annex didn't need me to believe in it. It only needed me to make one wrong choice, and I'd already done that. The corridor should have been a short walk from the West River door back to the console. I'd crossed it enough times to know the distance without thinking. This time it felt longer, like the annex had pulled on its own geometry, the way a machine pulls on a cable under load. I kept my eyes open until they burned, because blinking suddenly felt like giving the building permission to get ahead of me. The phone line started again behind me, steady and patient. It didn't sound urgent. It sounded inevitable. When I stepped into the control room, the 2 yellow lines in front of the main console looked brighter than they had earlier, too clean, too deliberate. They weren't a safety marker. They were a target. I tried to anchor myself in procedure, console, hydraulics, rail signal, camera 3. Everything on the screens looked normal, but my hands told a different story. Every input lagged by a fraction of a second. The fluorescent lights stuttered once, then steady, then stuttered again. On the next dip, the emergency strip lights in the corridor flicked on with a thin, sick glow, out of rhythm with the overhead fixtures. The radio hissed once at my belt, and then went dead. Then, the knocking started under the floor, near the base of the console, inside the conduit run that disappeared into the concrete. It wasn't random. It was measured, evenly spaced taps that carried vibration into my teeth. With the vibration came the smell of metal, sharp and clean like coins warmed in a pocket, clinging to the back of my throat. The pattern changed, and my body understood before my mind did. It was counting. 3, then 4, then 5. The pauses precise enough to feel intentional. The annex wasn't making noise. It was marking time. I muttered, "Oh, shit." Something shifted beneath the floor near the yellow lines. Not a quake, not a collapse, a subtle lift, like a panel had unseated itself by a few millimeters. The edge of a maintenance hatch I hadn't noticed before caught the emergency light and flashed dull metal. A cold draft breathed up through the seam, carrying that same metal smell, but heavier, older, like scorched insulation trapped under concrete. The phone stopped ringing. The silence after it felt like pressure. The emergency lights fluttered in quick, uneven bursts, and my shadow on the wall jumped late, arriving after my body moved like a reflection that couldn't keep up. The Line 9 voice barked, "Stand between the yellow lines." It didn't come from the handset. It didn't come from the radio. It came from the room itself, filling the air like heat. My feet wanted to move. I forced my weight to stay outside the paint and kept my gaze fixed, because the moment I blinked at the west door porthole, my reflection had lagged. I said quietly, "What the hell is that?" The counting resumed below the floor, faster now. The console fans dropped in pitch, strained, and the hydraulics needle trembled as if the bridge mechanism was testing its own movement without permission. Outside, steel groaned low and distant, the sound of weight shifting under strain. I glanced toward the corridor and caught the West River door porthole glass reflecting a warped oval of light. My face floated there, pale and stretched at the edges. For a second it matched me, then it desynced again, delayed by a fraction of a second. My eyelids twitched with the urge to blink. I forced them open wider until my eyes watered and the tears only made the room blur at the edges. I muttered, "No, no, no." Camera 3 stayed on the empty approach road, barrier arms down, bridge deck still, but for a blink of time the deck line in the feed looked wrong, a seam that shouldn't exist showing itself before the image corrected. At the same time, the knocking hit 10 and stopped. The sudden quiet made my ears ring. I tried to stay calm. "You've got to be kidding me." The emergency light strobed once, a deliberate on-off, and that single strobe lined up with my heartbeat in a way that made me feel measured. The yellow lines looked like a doorway drawn on the floor. The vibration returned, deeper now, pushing through the concrete like a drum beat, and the hatch seam widened by another hair. The command stayed in the room, not repeated, just present, like a pressure on my chest. I snapped, "No!" Saying it out loud didn't make me brave. It made the refusal real, and the annex answered by tightening the rhythm. The vibration coaxed my balance forward, trying to pull my weight off-center. I spread my stance and kept my boots planted outside the paint. My eyes burned. I held them open like it was a physical fight, because I knew what blinking meant here, a surrendered frame, a tiny gap where the annex could rewrite timing. The taps below the floor counted again, not just numbers, but steps in a process. The rules weren't random warnings. They were guardrails around an operation. The annex wasn't haunted in the way people mean. It was functional. It needed a human component aligned to its beat. The yellow lines were the timing mark. The hydraulics needle rose a fraction, dipped, rose again. Outside the window, steel groaned a second time. The air thickened until it felt like breathing through fabric. The counting paused, waiting, like it expected compliance. That's when the truth landed, ugly and clean. The bridge wasn't being tested for traffic. The rhythm wasn't about ships or schedules. It was about letting something cross. My voice came out flat. "This bridge doesn't lift for ships. It lifts to let something pass. The moment I said it, the vibration eased, not because the danger had ended, but because it had gotten what it wanted, my acknowledgement. The emergency light steadied for a breath, and in that brief calm I understood the worst part. The process didn't need my belief. It needed my participation, willingly or not. I didn't beat it by being brave. I beat it by being small and mean and practical, the way you deal with a machine that's trying to take your hands. The 2 yellow lines wanted my weight and my timing, so I stopped giving the system clean timing at all. I flipped the console out of its smooth loop and forced a manual cycle to stall. Then, I killed the hydraulic sequence at the point where it needed rhythm, not power. The bridge groaned outside, halfway committed, then settled back with a strained metallic sigh like it had been denied a breath. The counting in the conduit faltered, tried to restart, and then broke apart into uneven taps that couldn't find the next number. The printer chirped again, fast, almost angry, spitting fresh slips like it was trying to keep me in the process. I grabbed them without reading, just the warm paper edges, and carried them to the archive cabinet. I broke the one rule she'd screamed at me, because the alternative was worse. The lead wire was still twisted tight, but I had the keys Nora gave me, and I had hands that knew how to do one thing at a time. I cracked the seal just enough to open the door, shoved the slips inside, and slammed it shut. Then, I rewound the lead wire with shaking fingers and twisted it back until it looked exactly the way it had before. When I stepped away, the cabinet could have been untouched. The only difference was the heat in my pocket where the last slip had been, like a brand that wouldn't cool. I went back to the control room long enough to keep my exit from turning into a mistake. I didn't clean up. I didn't reset anything. I only took my badge and my keys and kept my eyes off the West River door. I clipped the radio close, even though it felt like carrying a live wire, and I forced my voice into something that sounded final. I barked over the radio. "Vic, I'm leaving. I'm done." There was a beat of silence, and then Vic answered, lower than before, like he didn't want the room to hear him. Vic said quietly over the radio, "If you walk out, don't look at the river." I didn't ask why. I didn't argue. I just moved. I locked the door behind me and walked to my car with my shoulders tight and my hands cold. The sky was starting to thin at the horizon, not quite light, just less black. And that almost made it worse. Dawn makes people careless. Dawn makes them look around. I kept my eyes on the gravel and the glow of Highway 17 through the trees. I drove out slow, then faster, then normal. When the annex finally disappeared in the mirror, I let myself breathe, just once, like I'd been holding it all night. A few miles down the highway, my phone lit up on the seat beside me. Missed call. Line 9. No number, no timestamp that helped. Just the name, like it belonged in my life. My hand went to my jacket pocket without thinking. A strip of warm thermal paper was folded there, fresh enough to still feel alive. It listed tomorrow night's shift, but not at Rivermouth. A different point along Highway 17, another annex name I'd never heard, written like it was already assigned, like the schedule had moved with me. I muttered, "It knows my name."